Knock, knock, knock. Is the beautiful community there? It is. Hi, it's lovely to be with you. We'll talk probably for 20 minutes, and I'm not likely to make sense much today because I'm able to be with you and sitting up, but only just because my health has not been good. So we're going to give this a go and see how this goes. The request that I'm half fulfilling and half betraying is to take a look at a piece by journalist Michel in Politico called 5 Scenarios for Russia After Putin's Next Term. But we'll only talk about it indirectly. We'll look at the tongue-in-cheek odds that the piece allocates to different post-2030 scenarios in Russia. I'll say a couple of words about how far we can predict this sort of stuff at all. And then I'll go on a rant, low energy, but high levels of happiness, but low energy rant about depoliticization as ever, but also about journalistic ethics around things that just look very, very minor, but aren't. Because when they accumulate these minor things, they do various kinds of bad stuff that destabilizes our democracy. So, the piece gives 5 scenarios with tongue-in-cheek percentages of likelihood sellotaped onto them. The most likely scenario is long live the tyrant in the Kremlin. 45 to 50% chance Putin is there after 2030. Now, we know that not only political but also biological things can intervene. And we know that Putin's own longevity doctor himself died in his 70s only a few weeks ago. The second scenario is a technocratic reset, 20 to 25% odds. And by that, let's just presume for the benefit of this chat that we mean second-tier folks in the Putin regime who are less maniacally imperialistic coming to power. 3, nationalists rising 15 to 20%, and here you can think of some kind of a radicalized, messianic, perhaps, junta. 4, Russia disintegrates 10 to 15%, and here the author is known for talking up that scenario, so that means not Russia peeling off at the edges, but genuine fracturing of the country. Something that I'm both alarmist about, actually, but also anti-alarmist in different senses. And if you want more on that, of course, there's a video that most of you would have seen about the scenario of the breakup of Russia, how to think about it on the main channel. And I'll link that up at the end of this video, but do not watch it a second time. It's a big meal. No need to watch it again if you've seen it. Last scenario, democracy flowers, 5 to 10%, the least likely scenario according to the author. Now, because we are meandering today, I'm going to make a sidetrack here that I'd not normally torture you with, but let's do it. There's nothing wrong with these percentages as psychological clues. But it's just important to, for a moment, look at what would go wrong if we took them to be more than psychological clues, which I don't take the piece to be doing. And that's that we'd get in the business of making historical predictions. And when we're in the realm of human action, human judgment, on a large scale, mediated by a multiplicity of institutions and social practices, we are in a realm in which prediction, and indeed even retrodiction, should only be done with a pair of pliers. There are indeed often universal features of political life, universal features of human nature you can rely on to make predictions. But it's very important that we are very conservative about making ourselves dependent on regularities, simply because the social sciences cannot epistemically tail the natural sciences. Not because they are fragile and imperfect, but because they require more local, more parochial, more embodied kinds of explanation, much more dependent on social interpretation. So there is a philosopher of the older generation called Alistair MacIntyre who likes to tell a story about a man in the early stages of the second half of the 20th century who wanted to generate a theory of holes. Yes, holes in the ground, holes dug by children, holes created by bombs, holes created by industrialization. And he wanted to make social scientific generalizations about all forms of human hole production. He discovered that there were many more holes in North America than there were in South America, that holes indeed correlated with industrialization, that there seemed to be many holes in Vietnam. And Alistair MacIntyre's joke is that if the man had simply substituted holes for democratization, what he'd been saying would have been just as silly, but he would have been welcomed with open arms by the American Political Science Association. So we've got to be humble here. And I remember laughing out loud in my postgrad time at Oxford, which was the only time in my life I engaged in a little bit of depth in comparative politics, which is not what my background is at all. It's moral and political philosophy. But during that moment, I was in a discussion in which a paper was presented, discussed, not presented, that ended with the sentence, revolutions do not occur beyond this particular threshold of GDP, comma, except in Argentina. So let's give ourselves a flavor of the gap rather than elaborating it further via a couple of sentences. Sentence 1. Every object attracts every other object with a force directly proportional to its mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Second sentence. Americans supporting Ukraine between 2022 and 2024 generally voted Democrat, but many also voted Republican, Green, and for other candidates. That second statement is not about all Americans. It's not about all periods. It's not universal. It's not exact. It's not general. Torture over. Okay, let's move on. My advice when you look at these sort of 5 scenarios, Putin in power, technocratic reset, nationalists rising, who are even more radical than Putin, that's a curious scenario because one might say that it's not possible to be more radical than Putin, that Putin is himself wanting to take the country in an obscurantist and a broad escalatory direction that he feels he's not ready for yet, but he hopes to be ready for in the future. And therefore it is in the context of Putin's connection between escalation abroad and regime security and Putin's mystical tendencies. In the context of these, it is a good question whether it's even possible to be more radical and more apocalyptic than Putin. Anyway, Russian disintegration, democratic flourishing. One recommendation I have is that while these boxes are excellent, come to them second. First, just start with an even simpler box of whether you're seeing a gradual end to this story that is going to end. It is a self-immolating imperial project. A gradual end to this story or a rapid and sudden unraveling. And what I want you to beware of is when the commentariat except for the best experts who are much more stable. But when the commentator just blow with the wind, and in 2023, you'd often hear that Putin was on edge and fragile and unstable. In 2024, you're now hearing that the Putin regime has consolidated and is stable again. And there is a lot of truth to both, actually. They are different messages, in part because circumstances have changed, in part. But there is also a sense of a kind of arbitrary, fashionable swish from one side to the next. And what I recommend is to have a little bit of an eye on this being a 50-50 situation, right? Rather than a situation which just swings from left to right according to fashions that you shouldn't follow. That's to say, yes, the Putin regime is stable now, but it could collapse in 3 years. It just could. So don't blow about in the wind like this. The limited part of the article I want to look at, that'll raise both journalistic and political questions, is about the author's recommendations for what the West should do in each scenario. And I'll just skim through them and give you a taste of them, and then express a modicum of displeasure about them. For an educational purpose, not to knock for the sake of knocking. Long live President Putin's scenario. If that's what's happening, then the West should ratchet up pressure, deepen partnerships with Russia's neighbors, and recognize that so long as Putin remains in power, Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine will continue and may escalate beyond Ukraine. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all. There is a question of what else might be said, but there is nothing wrong with that. A technocratic reset, 20-25% odds. Distrust, but verify. Calls for a reset should be treated with severe skepticism. Nationalists rising, just strengthen and expand sanctions and practice containment. Russia disintegrates. Encourage democratic forces around the country, be prudent around what happens with nuclear weapons, lean on those who successfully safeguarded the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal during the Soviet collapse, and prepare to be comfortable with territorial reorganization across the Russian Federation. Democracy flowers. 5-10% scenario. The best hope for a Russian democratization in Russia isn't in Russia itself, but in Ukraine. Just as colonial failures historically led to democratic post-imperial reforms, so too could a Ukrainian victory knock off Russian nationalism and Russian revanchism. If that were to happen, be open about lifting the sanctions, but trust, but verify. And only lift sanctions in return for concrete reforms and prosecutions of Putin-era officials. Perhaps above all else, and this is the bit that we'll dwell on in the journalistic dimension and in the political dimension too. Above all else, as sacrilegious as it may sound around now, don't pin your hopes on a single leader. Navalny was the clear lodestar for Russian democratic hopes, but even he had his nationalist weaknesses, claiming, for instance, that Crimea is rightfully Russian. If nothing else, Navalny should be the last singular Russian figure so many in the West place hopes of democratic reform on, a belief that has burned the West in the past and that led the West to miss just how ingrained Russian imperialism still is. Now let's say that the truth about the Russian opposition, the truth about Navalny isn't absolutely central to us. I will say a few things about it. But this business of how to think in a more political way about what our interests are on on Russian space, how what happens in the Russian space affects us and what our interests are, consequently, and how to think about journalistic ethics, about which I want to have a small rant. Navalny was the clear pin-up figure for Russian democratic hopes as perceived from the West. But, quote, even he had his nationalist weaknesses, claiming, for instance, that Crimea is rightfully Russian. Claiming, for instance, that Crimea is rightfully Russian. And that line is a link. And I'll tell you where I'm going with this. I tweeted today, when we let standards drop in serious journalism, when we allow small lies or unduly blur the line between news and opinion, this affects not just serious journalism, but everything. It corrupts discourse across the entire culture. And this is really, really important. You might think that if standards drop from 90 to 85% in what appears in the London Review of Books or in the New York Review of Books, or even in Politico, that's just going to be a drop of a few percentage points of the quality of discourse in these publications. No, it doesn't work like that. When more serious journalism degrades, less serious journalism and less serious content degrades too. There is a permeation and a corrupting effect. Even when small circulation, serious publications drop their standards, the whole culture is affected. So it's important to think about it in these terms. Let's go back to the line. Navalny claimed that Crimea is rightfully Russian. This is not a major crime at all to say that. This is very minor, and it's not atypical. It's common. It's common, right? Now, what this is also is putting something into your tummy that is not responsible enough. Because unless you click through to the links and explore, which we'll do right now, you might well assume, looking at this, that Navalny simply approved of Putin's annexation of Crimea. You see, there is an ambiguity here, because the author isn't saying that Navalny approved of the annexation of Crimea, because the author knows, and as we'll see in a moment, himself says elsewhere, Navalny disapproved of the annexation. But thought that in some ways it would have been more organic for Crimea to be part of Russia and not part of Ukraine. I'll say something about that thought of Navalny's in a moment, directly. But I think the implication here is that Navalny probably approved of the annexation. That's the implication that sentence gives. So it's not okay editorially, and it's not okay journalistically. Now, is this an innocent slip, the author wanting to point out that Navalny said plenty of things that the author takes issue with? That would be plausible if the author wasn't regularly criticized for saying misrepresentative things about Navalny. So the author is aware that there are criticisms of him, and as a result, this is not an innocent slip. It's a manipulative style of communication that is incompatible with journalistic ethics. Because journalistic ethics say Navalny said that Crimea is rightfully Russian, if you think he said that, but he opposed the annexation. Or Navalny liked the idea of Crimea being Russian, but he opposed Russia taking it. And then we reach another problem, journalistically. And this is really, really minor, but it's everywhere. Virtually every second article you read anywhere does this. And I'm saying unacceptable. Culturally ubiquitous, but culturally unacceptable. Let's click through. Where do we land? If we click through on that sentence, by the way, when you write a piece like this, you're sometimes responsible for the links out from your piece, but are often not responsible. So let's just be aware of that. So we link to an October 2022 article in New Republic by Michel, in which he says, in his live journal post in 2014, Navalny wrote that the fact that Ukraine controlled Crimea, an area transferred by Soviet authorities to the Ukrainian SSR in the 50s, was, quote, wrong, unfair, and insulting to any normal resident of the Russian Federation. Michel goes on to say, however, Navalny has repeatedly condemned the method with which Putin seized Crimea and called it an egregious violation of all international regularities, and called for those responsible for this brutalizing of international norms to be held to account, specifically via sanctions being imposed on Russian officials following the annexation. Navalny further added, changing the borders of states in Europe using troops and force is unacceptable. So we have clicked through, and so far it looks like we've landed on a piece that, what slanted text is really irrelevant to us, but a piece that gives us the full context, right? Because what we originally had wasn't a lie, but it was misrepresentative, and a deliberately misrepresentative account of Navalny's relationship with what happened in 2014 and after. Now, it gets worse. Because, of course, this article from Michel is from 2022. And in 2023, Navalny said that Ukraine is unqualifiedly to be recognized in its 1991 borders. So it's not just that the original line doesn't give the full context. It's that it leads us through into a piece that doesn't give us an updated understanding of where Navalny is at, because the piece says Navalny has never called without reservation for Crimea to be recognized as Ukrainian. And of course, arguably at least, that statement that Ukraine is unequivocally in its 1991 borders is such a call. Now, if we click even further onto the link to Navalny's own 2014 blog that's still up, what do we get there? What we get there is Navalny indeed saying the very thing Michel attributed to him, that it's weird and insulting for Russians to see Crimea as part of Ukraine, not part of Russia, but with three things that follow that statement by Navalny. One is that the annexation is wrong because it's illegal and it violates international agreements. Two, It's wrong because it violates international norms. And he mocks Putin himself for, in his early phase, saying that he wouldn't be engaged in imperialist practices. And thirdly, the referendum is illegitimate. Now, let me just make a couple of side remarks as having a casual conversation. It is unhealthy for Russia to want Crimea. And this remark of Navalny's is in many ways unhealthy because about how natural it feels to have Crimea as part of Russia, how unnatural it feels to have Crimea as part of Ukraine. It's unhealthy because it encourages, among other things, a kind of unboundariness that is indeed part of imperialist attitude. And there is this pathology of unboundariness in everyday political thought in Russia that is unhealthy. I mean, we have it a bit in the West, but they just have it in an extreme way. And why not a quick remark about the legitimacy of referendums? As a political philosopher, I can't recognize very easily, I'm sure there could be some imaginary counterexamples, but I can't recognize very easily what it means to have two countries and a bit of one country moving to the other country in one progression. Even in an idealized form, I don't recognize the legitimacy of that. So it's not just that the referendum was illegitimate and could have been legitimate. It's rather that if you are a bit of a country and you want to join another country, what you do is you have a referendum on independence. And if the big country that you're part of lets you go and you choose to go via referendum, you go to being independent. You go to being your own little country. And only once you are your own little country, you can then have a second referendum to join another new country. So it has to be in these two steps for me to say as a political philosopher that I recognize this as legitimate at all, in principle. So you need to have two referendums, not one that are free and fair. So this is really my meditation on journalism. What I see here is nothing but common practice. And I'm saying that common practice is not just trivially sloppy and a little bit of a conflation of factuality with opinion, thereby losing key context. It's toxic. And we do it and we shouldn't do it. And it doesn't matter the topic is Navalny here. It could be broccoli, right? The point is, even if the topic is broccoli, we should not do this. Now let's get to the politics of it. Perhaps above all else, we shouldn't pin our hopes on a single leader. Michel says. And then he says that Navalny had his weaknesses, in particular his imperialist tendencies. And then that sentence comes that Navalny said that Navalny's view is that Crimea is rightfully Russian, which I called out as being a manipulative omission of context. This implies a kind of over-centering of Navalny by the West. And I want to say I'm against centering Navalny. I don't quite recognize the West centering Navalny, but I do know who is centering Navalny. Michel. If you think that the main thing to say about the Russian opposition, and specifically about Navalny, is a moral observation, that's the main thing to say in a special section of your article, where you talk about what politically the West should do, then you're engaged in depoliticization. I've tweeted about that too. And here is what I've said. Throwing small poison darts at the Russian opposition based on moral but not political objections, e.g. imperial mindset, is a depoliticized activity that mirrors the very thing that's wrong with the Russian opposition. Instead, we should demand from the Russian opposition politicization, proposals which engage various Russian demographics on key issues like inequality, centralization, foreign policy. We should demand from them alliance formation, and we should demand from them institutionalization of their own activities abroad. Where is your parliament in which you quarrel? Your parliament in exile. Don't have a parliament? Have some other structure. Where is it? Why aren't you hitting the top 3 or 4 issues that all Russian demographics can be mobilized around? Why haven't you institutionalized yourselves? Why are you engaging in a recirculation of moral claims? Why are you ineffective at delegitimizing Putin? By the way, if you were doing all of these things better, this is what we would do for you. Politics. I think this is enough. Thank you for surviving this, and lots of love and talk soon.